In full transparency, this podcast series was originally entitled America After Trump, America's Second Reconstruction. I recorded the first 3 episodes before the election on November 5th. Even though the polling had the presidential race tied, I never thought this country would put Trump back into office, especially after January 6th and the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Well, I've never been so wrong. So with the election of Donald J. Trump on November 5th, 2024, I changed the title of this podcast to Trump's America, because whether you like it or not, we are living in Trump's America. I didn't want to throw the first 3 episodes into the trash. I thought they were really great conversations that I wanted to share with you. So forgive me on a couple of questions that are not relevant anymore, but I hope you enjoy the 95% of each episode that is extremely relevant in our current reality. Thank you. Welcome to America After Trump, America's Second Reconstruction. I'm your host, Mick Larson. Today's podcast guest is Dr. Andrew Hartman. He is a professor of history at Illinois State University. He's the author of A War for the Soul of America, A History of the Culture Wars, published in 2015. It's a book that's just as relevant today as it was 9 years ago. I had the opportunity to sit down with Andrew on the campus of Illinois State. All right, let's get to the interview. Andrew, welcome to the podcast. You've authored some interesting and important books in the past, and I know you're working on a new book. Why don't you talk about your past and current book, along with a passion for teaching history here at Illinois State?
Sure. So I've written 3 books or monographs. The first one is titled Education in the Cold War, and that was a look at how Americans thought about education, educational politics, and how it changed during the Cold War. And then my second book, which really has sold a lot of copies because it's a hot topic and remains a hot topic, is titled A War for the Soul of America, A History of the Culture Wars. Originally published in 2015, but thanks to a certain President Trump, it sold really well, and my publisher, the University of Chicago Press, wanted me to write a second edition, so that came out in 2019. And then I have a new book coming out in April of 2025 titled Karl Marx in America. It's a long look at how Americans have thought about Karl Marx.
And without giving anything away on the book, what's something you can say about your new book that would kind of illuminate, some of what it's about?
Yeah, so it starts really with what Marx himself thought about the United States, because he wrote extensively about the U.S., especially during the Civil War. And then it kind of chapter by chapter goes chronologically. There's a lot of labor history, how the labor unions and various socialist and communist parties took up his ideas in the United States. But there's also plenty on Cold War liberals and conservatives and the New Left, and just the various interpretations of Marx and how it helped them make sense of the American project. And it goes all the way up to the present.
Oh, can't wait to read it.
Yeah, thanks.
In April 2025.
April of 2025, yes.
Well, you're the perfect person to agree or disagree with my theory that the name of this podcast is, Trump after, or America After Trump, mm-hmm. America's Second Reconstruction. And I'm saying America's Second Reconstruction because, the attack on the Capitol, mm-hmm.
we're
We're so polarized. You have a level of disinformation that we somehow need to overcome. So what do you think about my yay or nay on my theory of a second Reconstruction of some sort?
I like it. It's very hopeful. Some historians of the civil rights movement call that the second Reconstruction.
I could totally see that.
Yeah, so you could even call it the third Reconstruction. But it does seem, although we have not been fighting a civil war in the way in which Americans did in the 1860s.
We're doing it at the ballot box instead of with arms.
Yeah, mostly, right?
Except for January 6th.
Yeah. And the 2 attempts on Trump's life recently as well. It does feel like the rhetoric is pitched enough to where some people would describe it as like a civil war of sorts.
Well, it keeps coming up.
Yeah. And it's not regional. It's not actually a civil war. And American political rhetoric has never been sort of soft and squishy.
Or nuanced.
That's true. Although I think we've had variations in nuance. I think we're at a low point in terms of the lack of nuance. But yeah, things are pretty heated, so that works for me.
Good. Well, I'm glad you agree, because I was like, it's just a feeling, and I get a lot of comments from people that are actually worried about violence after the election gets over with.
Yeah, understandably so. Trump's as we saw in 2020, January 2021, Trump's most ardent supporters are well armed and willing to do things, even unconstitutional things, to help along his campaign or his presidency. So I think that's understandable. I guess I'm optimistic it won't come to that, but it's understandable.
I guess it's one, maybe a correlation with America's second Reconstruction is the fact that there is potential violence. There was violence. There are people that are okay with this not being a democracy to some degree. I don't know if that's true or if that's just the way it looks, but what are your thoughts about people being like, well, the election wasn't stolen, but we're going to say it's stolen and we're going to try to stop it?
Yeah, so I guess how people define democracy it varies, and so I don't think most of the January 6 actors, for example, thought they were acting against democracy. In fact, I think they truly believed they were acting in favor of democracy. They were like trying to rescue.
Sure, and that's what Trump said.
It's what he said, and I think most of them believed it. So it's a tricky thing, right? Much of Trump's rhetoric about things he would do if he were to win the election come from a place of authoritarianism, anti-democratic sentiment, but I don't even know if he really thinks that they're anti-democratic, right?
Well, if you're delusional.
Yeah.
I mean, there are facts involved in this.
Of course.
And there were no facts that there was any,
Yeah.
election. I mean, Trump's the only Republican who didn't win. Everybody else, all the other Republicans won down ballot. So
yeah. No, I mean, I agree there are facts and that he denies them. And whether he's delusional or intentionally trying to derail democracy, I guess, is up for debate. But there's a long line. This goes back in U.S. history. Nixon, for example, once told the reporter David Frost that when the president does it, it's not against the law. So Trump's
that's more like an authoritarian.
Yeah. So Trump's not the first, but it's definitely something to be on guard against.
What about any other historical examples?
Well, so it's oftentimes during war, and it's oftentimes there's a suspension of various sort of constitutional rights, habeas corpus, and sometimes it's by the presidents that many of us might consider some of the best. I mean, Abraham Lincoln, and I don't argue he should not have done this, but he suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War. Franklin Delano.
Is that an executive order?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Franklin Delano Roosevelt issued several executive orders that you could interpret as violations of civil liberties, not just putting Japanese and Japanese Americans in internment camps, but also cracking down on people who had stated sympathy for fascism and Hitler in the U.S. In what historian Leo Rebuffo calls a brown scare, kind of like a forerunner to the Red Scare. Mm-hmm. There was no constitutional warranty to do this, and so we could debate whether it was the right or wrong thing to do. There's a massive crackdown on civil liberties during World War I. Lots of people imprisoned for merely speaking out against the war. Over 1,000 people deported to Russia during immediately following World War I for various radical activities, including opposition to American entry into the war. So there's a long history of this, but I think what got Nixon into trouble, and then I think where Trump crosses the boundaries, is it's not just against various dissidents who seem like beyond the margins of the mainstream, but they are authoritarian against the other party, the Democratic Party, in the instance of Nixon and Trump, and that's like a river too far.
Right.
Yeah.
How would you describe Trump's rise, the Trump era, to a freshman class coming into university?
Well, I think it's he came to power. Well, there's a couple of historical sort of like trend lines, right?
Right.
There are Americans in American history who are sort of like authoritarian, demagogic, and speak very much in the sort of like anti-elite, authoritarian register.
So populism, basically?
Populism, like right-wing populism. A really good forerunner would be someone like George Wallace, the Alabama governor who ran for president several times in the 60s and 70s. If you go back and his speeches and commercials, his advertising is on YouTube. He sounds a little bit like Trump in many ways. Different accent, of course, but
Yeah, and what about before that, the guy from my home state, Kansas? What is that guy's name?
Well,
sorry, I hate to do this.
Yeah.
do this to you, but
well, you have various populists across the 20th century. Some of which, though, I don't know. Like they might speak in. I mean, populism has this long lineage, and it's just kind of like framing your whole political attempt at power in opposition to some sort of elite.
Yeah.
The original populists, I think, had valid reason to revolt against the banks, the railroads, the corporations that were making it very difficult for them to sustain their lives as small farmers. But you've seen that rhetoric register much more so on the right in the last 50 to 70 years. The Wallaces of the world. And of course, Trump has really picked up on that. But I also, when I talk about Trump to college freshmen, which I do, I also say you have to understand it's in a sort of global context of a rising authoritarian right. You've seen people like Trump come to power across the world, in Europe, in Brazil, various countries. And I think that this is a response to just the sort of like economic precarity or the economic insecurity that so many, really, we're talking billions of people across the planet have in the wake of, like globalization and decades of unregulated capitalism, environmental destruction, and liberal or centrist parties that have kind of failed to solve problems. And so people are looking for an easy solution, and the sort of like strong man who speaks to them in ways that makes them like kind of like a father figure. Those types really they make hay out of those kind of political vacuums.
The first thing that pops in my head when you say that is the fact that they are not addressing the real problems.
No.
They're just scapegoating immigrants, or like Brexit, or what Trump is doing. So it's really interesting that that there's not, let's say after Trump, there needs to be a narrative that addresses the real problems and not just these strongman, easy to fear and hate.
I would love that. Yeah. So if someone has lost their job to an immigrant, just to use the most sort of like obvious stereotype that Trump trades on,
I'd like to see the evidence.
I don't know that ever
I know, that's the crazy
really
thing.
happens, right? But if that has happened, or just sort of in a general sense, I would say the companies that replaced you with an immigrant are at fault, and this is why most big businesses support open borders or as much immigration from cheaper labor markets like Mexico or Central America as possible. So immigration's a real issue. I would never doubt that. And we should have some sort of like policy that is rational in relation to the labor market.
And we need immigrants. It's not like
we
can't go back to the early 1900s and have zero immigration.
No, and like immigration we're all immigrants.
I know, exactly. We are a country of immigrants.
Yeah, and I don't think we should change that. But it's a real issue, and so Trump offers easy solutions: build a wall, close the border, and demonizes the immigrants themselves and lumps them all in with criminal syndicates, etc. Yeah.
Do you think he could sell a message or a narrative of like, you're getting screwed by corporations who aren't paying enough taxes, that, you're not benefit. This country is built on capitalism, and it's built to make money for corporations. The military could be considered corporate welfare.
Yeah.
Do you think a message that would resonate with people? Like, hey, here's the real problem.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. I think, we're in this time of intense polarization between the two parties. I think there's a majority to be won by either party if they go after corporate America. So I would hope that it would be the party, and my guess is this would be the Democratic Party, which also embraces more multicultural or cosmopolitan
and
unions, feminism. That's my hope. I think we could build a multicultural kind of social democracy majority. The Democratic Party, for the most part, with a few recent exceptions, has refused to do that. The Republican Party, on the other hand, I think could build a majority, likewise, if they went after corporate America, but sort of fused it with a cultural nationalism. Like, I think there's a majority to be won by either party, but either party would have to make the really difficult decision of, like,
saying no to a lot of money.
Saying no to the money that funds their elections, funds everything they do in politics. And so we're not there yet, but I feel like it could happen. I would really rather it happen on the Democratic Party side, because a cultural national... it's dangerous. It's dangerous. And one of the things that Trump... one of the reasons he won in 2016, if you really sort of dig into his speeches and the numbers, it's talking about how corporate America had failed the working class and, like, the industrial working class in the Midwest.
True.
It's true. Now, as president, he didn't do anything about it, except for a couple of...
he cut taxes for him.
He cut taxes really for the rich.
Yeah.
And then also...
and corporations.
And then there were a couple of... tariffs with China, which didn't help really anybody, except for increased tensions with China. But he won the election in part. There are other appeals, of course, but in part because he had this sort of economic message. He also had a sort of, I wouldn't call it isolationist, but a sort of like dismissal of the international sort of world order that the United States has built since World War II, but especially after the Cold War. That also is popular. Like, people are tired of sending Americans overseas to police the world. People are really tired of that.
Sure.
So I think there's popularity there as well. So even though I don't think he fulfilled any of those types of promises when he was president, and I seriously doubt he would if he were reelected, there's like hints of sort of like truth in a couple of his messages that I think one of the two parties could really gain traction from.
And I think in Kamala Harris's campaign, she tried to, I think, educate people like, hey, it's important to support Ukraine. We actually benefit from this world order immensely.
Yeah.
And to break it down and walk away from it would be kind of like Brexit, I guess. But, to turn your back economically, it's like, that's not really going to work in the long run. It might sound good, feel good.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Like, I guess what I see is that the U.S. has operated sort of in triumphalist fashion since the end of the Cold War, and has expanded our power into Eastern Europe, and that's been very provocative to Russia. Mm-hmm. So no fan of Putin here, and no fan of sort of like the turn Russia has taken in its politics in the last 20 years. But I think that the U.S. could back off of that. Mm-hmm. I think it's pretty provocative to arm Ukraine in this situation. Mm-hmm. But, that's me, my personal opinion more so than my...
Right.
I mean, I think I'm shaped by my understanding of history, but...
Oh, sure. Well,
there are plenty of historians who disagree with me there.
Do we need a healthy Republican Party?
No, I don't think so.
You don't think so?
No. I would much rather a healthy Democratic
in a two-party system. But, yeah.
Like, I don't think either party is healthy in the sense that they're not really truly addressing the needs of most people. The Democratic Party does a better job of it than the Republican Party. In some instances, much better. But not nearly good enough. So if one of the two parties, and in this case I would hope it would be the Democrats, if they actually truly worked to address the needs of most Americans, that would be enough, and then they'd win a majority. So, like, for example, in the 1930s, and this sort of lasted for much of the sort of up until really Nixon, the Democratic Party really controlled the electoral system. A few Republicans got elected here or there, but they had to do so on Democratic Party terms, and so the Republican Party, I guess you could call was a functioning minority party, and that's good. But I don't care if they're functioning or not. I just want them in the minority.
Right. But it would be nice to have a Republican Party that was dealing in facts that you could actually solve some problems with. But, you know.
So, yes, true. I still think, like, if the Democratic Party controlled the government through a majority, that would be the best way to get things done. And historically speaking, I think that's how we got the New Deal. That's how we got the Great Society.
Civil
Democratic
rights.
majorities, Democratic majorities.
Yeah, I think it's important to remind people that, like you said, democracy could be defined in different ways, but really the United States wasn't a full democracy until after the civil rights movements. Is that true?
I think that's true. Yeah, you can't, like, South Africa was not a democracy until the end of apartheid. I could go on. There are lots of nations still with us currently that deny rights to vast minorities within their country that call themselves democracies, and you can't consider them a democracy. So yeah, I think that's right.
Well, I really like your answer about, you know, you prefer a strong Democratic Party, and I'll give you my theory of why. Is I've always thought the Democratic Party believed in government, believes that the government can be a positive force in everyone's lives, and wants to solve problems. And so I think the Democratic Party is fine with facts, because you've got to have facts to make changes, or otherwise you're just spinning your wheels. And to me, then the Republican Party, to me, you know, doesn't like government, even though they want to run it. They want smaller government, and to me, smaller government means less help for a lot of people, because that's what big government does, is help everybody. So to me, the Republican Party is interested in power, but not really solving problems per se, and that creates a real problem with when I say we need a healthy Republican Party, I'm just saying, like, we need some sane people so that we've got big problems and we've got to solve these problems. So you've got to have two people at least functioning in some way. But, I mean, what do you think about that theory that there's the Democratic Party likes to fix things and the Republicans like, yeah, whatever?
No, I think that's true. So the Republican Party was essentially captured by a conservative movement in the late 70s, and it hasn't shifted gears since then. And one of the key pillars of the conservative movement that captured the Republican Party was a sort of corporate libertarianism, anti-tax, anti-use of government to solve social problems. So the Republican Party has been very sort of against social welfare, against the Department of Education, against the United Nations, against various institutions that we as Americans historically not only built, but that as you maintain, the Democratic Party still thinks are necessary to function as a civilized society. That is certainly the case. And so, yeah, if the Republican Party was a different party, and if the conservative movement within it, if they weeded it out, that would be great. But I guess historically speaking, it's that conservative movement within the Republican Party is so powerful that I'm not optimistic it's going to happen anytime in the near future. You know, they're one of the two most powerful political parties in the world, that is Republicans, and they, as a matter of policy, deny that humans have anything to do with climate change. I mean, that's a real problem. I don't think the solution is to change the Republican Party and hope that they embrace facts. I think the solution is to win Democratic majorities so that their cuckoo theories are irrelevant.
Right. No, I agree with that.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, there's many ways to do this, but yours is like the easiest, most obvious, and has worked in the past.
Yes.
Yeah. What concerns you about the far left and the far right?
The far left has no power, so it doesn't really concern me.
Right.
What concerns me, I wish the far left was bigger and better organized and could actually tilt the Democratic Party in ways that I think would be beneficial, and that would make it a majority party. But the far left is much more interested in sort of infighting, and I think is way too concerned with sort of identity-based or cultural politics to sort of help build the majority.
What are the issues that you like on the far left?
Universal health care. It's crazy that that's a far left, that it takes Bernie Sanders to inject that into the mainstream.
We're going to get there.
Yeah. Cheaper housing, just like, to me, this isn't far left, but in an American political spectrum, it is far left. It would be great if we had a party, the Democratic Party, which wanted to achieve the things that have been achieved in like the Scandinavian countries in terms of like a social democracy. But so the far left, there's lots of people on the left who want these things. Most do, but they seem to prioritize sometimes other things. So to me, it's just sort of disorganization, and a sort of like a symptom of lack of power. The far right, on the other hand, is far more numerous in the U.S. than the far left, and has much more power in terms of its sway in the Republican Party, is much more violent, is much more willing to do things like January 6th. So the far right is extremely concerning. The far right, like for example, you go back to 2017 and there's the march in Charlottesville, Virginia, in order to rescue the memorial to Robert E. Lee. These are the type of things that are much more frightening to the politics, I think, than anything the far left could hope to muster.
Yeah, unfortunately. What about white Christian nationalism? What does that concern you? And you could probably talk about the history of it as well.
Yeah. So I guess I would say a couple of things about that. Historically speaking, white evangelicals have been a really important part of the American population going back to the Second Great Awakening of the 1830s. And that if they act together as a group politically, they're extremely powerful and have been shown to be able to win majorities. Historically speaking, that we're probably talking about 25% of the population. It might be a little less now, but it's and this Christian right, this white evangelical Christian right, it was part of the process of capturing the Republican Party in the 60s and 70s, largely in response both to sort of the New Deal, but even more so some of the sort of gains by a cultural left in terms of secularization. And here I'm talking about like the Supreme Court deciding that prayer in school was unconstitutional, the empowerment of women in public sphere, Roe v. Wade especially, and abortion. And so this...
And civil rights.
Well, and civil rights, yeah, because lots of white evangelicals, of course, are from the South.
Yeah.
And so that sort of like really large, important base to American politics, when it took over when it really became the core voting bloc in the Republican Party, this is partly why you've seen this rightward shift in the Republican Party. Now, this white evangelical, what you might call Christian nationalism, is still with us. They want a Christian nation, and part of the appeal of Make America Great might have been to them this sort of notion that the U.S. used to be a Christian nation and is no longer white Christian nation.
Correct.
But I don't, like, over the generations, I guess they don't have the same kind of numbers. They're not as church-going as they used to be, so they're not listening to religious leaders to the degree that they used to be. And they're much more sort of, well, I mean, they all see Trump as one of their leaders, and you might say that that's discouraging.
Antithetical.
Antithetical, yeah. But, this could go back to Reagan. Reagan wasn't exactly the most, like, virtuous person, and they loved him. But I guess I would say that the reason why Trump has had success is not only because lots of white evangelicals see him as like kind of like this weird sort of anti-hero that's going to rescue them from secularism. And indeed, Trump's the one who gave them the Supreme Court that finally overturned Roe v. Wade. But also, Trump appeals to a sort of like more generic form of authoritarianism, people who want a strongman, just to sort of like shake things up. And that's why, like, it's not just white people who support Trump anymore. He appeals to a growing number of working class,
especially males,
minority men, especially. And I think it's this like, there's a sort of like turn against. So part of it might be in just sort of patriarchal authoritarianism, but I think part of it is also this sort of turn against this sense that the Democratic Party is just too paternalistic in the way in which they sort of speak to them. Like, there's this expectation that Democrats and liberals have long had that the future is ours because eventually we're going to be a majority-minority country, and of course minorities will vote Democratic, but that is they haven't really worked to win over these people to the degree necessary, and so this assumption is ill-fitting. I mean, black people don't all think the same way.
Of course, nor Hispanics and Latinos.
Or Muslims, or the list goes on, right? People are diverse.
Yes, indeed. Talk a little bit about the coalition that is in the right, that they've kind of, you know better than me, but it seems like since Eisenhower was president, the far right hated Eisenhower, the John Birch Society, and all that stuff. So it's like, and then you've got the Southern Strategy, and then you've got Jimmy Carter talking about taxing churches, and that's things really. Yeah. Talk about how that came together.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right that the far right didn't love Eisenhower because he just wasn't far enough right for them. He governed as a New Deal president. Like, he wasn't out to chip away at the New Deal. And even though he was extremely cautious or hesitant to have the federal government intervene in civil rights in the South, like, he wanted it to go away, as really did almost every president up until Johnson. Just wanted it to go away so that they could deal with what they considered more important issues. He did send the National Guard into Arkansas. He was kind of compelled to do these things. Far right didn't like him for that. There was this sense that Joe McCarthy was the far right's hero, and Eisenhower, of course, at the end did not step up and defend Gunner Joe McCarthy. So he wasn't one of them. The Democrats before the 52 election were trying to recruit him to run as a Democrat. He was just seen as a war hero, kind of centrist.
Very moderate guy.
Yeah, moderate. Not very he wasn't seen as political or ideological. Which, wasn't true, but he wasn't seen as that way, right? He definitely was. He was more in the center. In some ways, Nixon was as well. And the far right, when Nixon was president, had serious issues for them. And in fact, because Nixon was the kind of guy, so there was a Democratic majority in Congress, and they were passing all kinds of liberal legislation, like the creation of OSHA, the creation of the EPA. And Nixon was the kind of guy like, well, I could veto it, but then they have the majority to override my veto. I might as well sign it and take credit. That was Nixon, right? Yeah. So for the far right, right-wing intellectuals especially, really had problems with Nixon as well, which is surprising because you think of Nixon as a much more conservative person than Eisenhower. And indeed, he was. In fact, the reason Eisenhower chose him as his vice president is to shore up the conservative base. But this is at a point in which the sort of right, the far right, wasn't very organized, and they didn't have just one party that they saw as their party. Now, most white evangelicals might have voted Republican, but they didn't feel like they had a say over the party. This really sort of changed during the 1970s, in part a response to various things going on. Roe v. Wade, as you mentioned, Jimmy Carter's sicking of the IRS on Christian private schools for disobeying sort of regulations with regards to desegregation. And they got extremely organized. So in 1979, you see the formation of Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority. They get very organized, and they helped elect Reagan, and Reagan was theirs. And really, since then, the Republican Party has just become more sort of intertwined with the Christian right. A few things here or there, like George H.W. Bush was not their guy, but his son certainly was. And weirdly enough,
a compassionate Christian.
Yeah, right. Ask the Iraqis about that.
Yeah, exactly.
But weirdly enough, Trump is also their man.
So you said something interesting in my documentary, What Would Jesus Do on Election Day, that, let's say during the 70s, the moral majority, they were looking for a candidate that reflected their values. Even though Jimmy Carter wasn't their guy, Jimmy Carter actually did, I think, reflect his values.
Yeah.
So now they've shifted to Trump,
Yeah.
who obviously does not reflect their values in any way. Talk about that shift.
Yeah, so there used to be, there's always been hypocrisy in politics.
Sure, of course.
Hypocrisy in human behavior.
Yeah.
But it used to be a much more stated sort of goal or objective of the Christian right that their candidates would behave more like they expected a good human Christian to behave, not cheat on his wife, not do drugs.
Not even maybe divorced.
Yeah, like not even divorced. The list goes on, right? But when they essentially, as I previously said, kind of took over the Republican Party, or they became sort of intertwined with the Republican Party, you have to play the very worldly game of politics. And so like someone like Ronald Reagan, at first when Reagan emerged as the likely candidate of the Republican Party in 1980, and really this goes back to his 76 campaign in the Republican Party primaries where he came close to winning the nomination against Gerald Ford, a lot of liberal onlookers and media were like, this is amazing. How could these religious conservatives support this guy? He's a Hollywood libertine. He's divorced. There were just rumors of problems with his kids, and just, he's a Hollywood guy. How could this? He's not from Georgia. Whereas when he's running against Jimmy Carter was a Southern Baptist. He did try to live his life in the way in which you would expect a Southern Baptist to live his life. Jimmy Carter cared deeply about issues that he considered Christian, but he just wasn't conservative enough for them. He kind of tried to tack to the middle on a lot of these cultural issues, feminism, abortion, and then, of course, there's the IRS thing with the Christian schools, and so they were looking for somebody else. And when Reagan, at a meeting of Christian evangelical leaders, said, I know you can't endorse me, because they were worried about their tax-exempt status, but I endorse you, they were like, here's our guy. And I think ever since then it's kind of been that way. George W. Bush, even though he had a previous record as an alcoholic, probably a cocaine user, it was a very American.
But he was born again.
Yeah, he was born again. And that's a very American, a very evangelical thing. We're going to forgive your sins, which is great.
Yeah.
That's a good thing.
It is.
And they forgave his sins, and he, I think he kind of lived more closely to what they'd expect. But then there's Trump. And I just think this is a case study in the sort of like decline of expectations.
The bar got really low.
The bar just got lower and lower, and he seems like the kind of strong man they need. He's an anti-hero. We don't care about his morality as long as he's like our guy, our anti-hero. He's our Tony Soprano.
Yeah. I have to wonder, based on what you just said, is that I get the impression that the evangelicals felt they were ignored, even though they were voting, and so nothing ever. It seems like on all their issues, nothing ever happened.
Yeah.
And I kind of wonder if that contributed to them voting for a guy that's not like them, but maybe deliver on their issues.
I think that's a really good point. Yeah. That could be one of the explanations for sure. Now Reagan didn't necessarily wasn't able to achieve much for them, but he certainly spoke a mean game, and most evangelicals never.
That was good enough probably at that time.
Yeah,
I don't know.
most evangelicals, they never gave up on him, and he invited their leaders into the White House regularly. So Jerry Falwell, for example, wasn't about to speak ill of Reagan because he didn't want to lose that invitation.
Correct.
But I think over time, this became maybe an issue. They weren't seeing much progress in Washington. They were achieving all sorts of things at the local and state level, but in Washington they weren't seeing much progress. And of course, abortion was their biggest issue. But what they they did achieve progress. It's just they didn't quite get to the 6 Supreme Court justices they needed, and now Trump gave them that. So,
this is more, I don't know if this is history or theological, but do you think white evangelicals have kind of shown their hand with the Trump thing, where like they're much more interested in power than following the teachings of Jesus?
Yeah, but
Or is that
that type of like, well, like again, you could say that's hypocrisy, but like there's always been hypocrisy in politics, and I don't think it's really going to convince them, or like this is something that, for example, I think liberals have really focused on in the Trump era, is like, look at this hypocrisy everywhere, but I don't think that's a very successful way to sort of like try to win majorities or attack your
definitely has not worked at all.
No. I mean, I think Trump has reveled in any type of attack that has been leveled against him, rhetorical or legal.
I'm sure there's like a list of 30 things you could say about why before Trump it would have got him 86th, right out, but not a problem anymore.
How quickly he dispensed with all the Republican candidates in 2006 in the primaries in 2016, it's just sent chills through that whole party. And then the way in which the base continually stuck with him through lots of tough times, I think he's taken over the Republican Party. So really that's going to be the most interesting thing to see after the election, is like what happens to this Republican Party.
That's one of the questions I have for you is there any historical precedent where somebody takes over a party completely, you've got the establishment telling everyone to vote against their guy and vote for Democrats, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger and many people. Is there any historical precedent for this?
I don't think so. I'd have to think hard about that. There have definitely been times when the losing party is kind of taken over by a person who represents a distinct movement or ideology, and it takes longer for that party to realize that their sort of route to success is not with this person or ideology. Like the Democratic Party of the early 20th century, when it was sort of captured by not the populist movement, but populist sensibilities in the Midwest and South, and William Jennings Bryan won its nomination several times. They were never going to win the presidency with him, likely, but of course he had sort of captured the party, and they couldn't sort of like change course. But in terms of like we might not have historical precedents for Trump, so that's why it's so interesting to see where we go from here. Yeah.
I agree. As a historian, are you surprised, considering Trump's lost every midterm, every election since he got elected, that they didn't move away from him after January 6th when they really had a chance to just flush him away?
Well, I guess if you look at if you look at it from 30,000 feet up, you would think that's really surprising. But sort of living on the ground through this thing, there hasn't been somebody to emerge that could challenge him. He continues to so easily dispense with his challengers. So his challengers seem weak, and there's a big enough base of Republican voters that has remained loyal to him that has allowed him to ride out the wave of the string of defeats.
And as he leaves the political scene, what happens to his base? That's like you said, that's going to be the most interesting thing to watch. What are some of the options that you see on the table?
A couple of different options. I think maybe Republicans fizzle out for a little while. Like they can't keep
a coalition together.
They can't keep this base together, maybe. Or the right person emerges and fills and takes on the new MAGA in chief.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, I think there is an opportunity for somebody to do that, especially if they work in sort of this cultural nationalist combined with anti-corporate realm. I don't see that as too likely. There are individuals who kind of speak that politics, like a Josh Hawley type, but is that the guy from Kansas you were thinking
Missouri.
of? Yeah. But
don't soil the name of Kansas.
yeah, right. But I just don't think he has anywhere near the charisma of a Trump that would be necessary to pull that off. So I don't know. It's a really uncharted waters.
It's going to be interesting to watch for sure. Tell me how your book, A War for the Soul of America, A History of the Culture Wars, is still so relevant, if not even more relevant today than when it was released in 2015.
It's funny. It's probably more relevant than ever. As I like to tell my friends, half kiddingly, what's bad for the country is good for book sales. When I first wrote it, so it was published in 2015, but I was putting the finishing touches on my conclusion in 2014. This is before Trump had announced his candidacy. And in the conclusion, I wrote that obviously the culture wars aren't going away, but they're going to be less important to our politics going forward, because I was much more focused on more attention drawn to like economic insecurity or inequality based upon like the Occupy Wall Street movement, and I thought that's where our politics were headed, and sort of like and also a pretty strong general critique of U.S. foreign policy based upon the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I just thought we were heading in that direction. Trump obviously ruined that prediction, and that's partly why I wrote a second edition in 2019 with a much lengthier conclusion that dealt with the Trump election and phenomenon. But I guess what Trump has made clear to me is that we're still very much in the culture wars that go back to the 1960s, and we're still like, this is history that runs deep. And although some of the issues we're debating about have changed, some have remained the same, but a lot of them have changed. They still...
And some have flipped, like abortion. Yeah,
but they still remain sort of like fought out in the same register, feels almost existential. As I argued in the book originally, the culture wars are a debate about what it means to be an American, and I think because people are so... on both left and right are so proud to be American in their various ways, even though the right's much more likely to proclaim that than the left. I think because of that pride in nation, that Americans are going to continue, like they're going to look at the other side and say, that's un-American, and that's really going to fuel political anger and conflict.
Like you said, we agree at being American, and we disagree what American is.
Yeah. Which is why Trump's slogan from 2016, which is still with us on red hats everywhere, is such a potent slogan. It really works for his people.
Tell me how far off base I am with this, but I kind of see culture war issues and culture buttons to be a substitute for policy, and the fact that, like I said before, the Democrats want to solve problems, they believe in government, and the Republicans not so much. And so instead of having some big policy besides tax cuts, they just like substitute culture war issues instead of policy. Is that...
Sometimes I think that's definitely true. The culture wars and sort of the anger they generate in the political sphere, I think oftentimes work better for Republicans than Democrats, in part because lots of Democrats or Democratic voters are Democrats because they want government to solve their problems, their big ticket issues like healthcare. So I think culture war issues in a political sphere work better for Republicans, although I wouldn't say the right wins the culture wars. I mean, I think if you think about most of the issues or terrain in which culture wars are fought, they're fought because the left has succeeded.
True.
Civil rights, feminism.
Yeah, they've been running up the score for decades.
Yeah, and so it's the way, like, for example, one of the reasons why there's been such a culture war over how history is taught in the schools, and I mean, this goes way back, but especially pronounced in the last 4 or 5 years, so much so that DeSantis in Florida has an anti-woke legislation that doesn't allow for the teaching of a whole bunch of things related to race in the schools. It's because of Black Lives Matter and the sort of worldwide attention that movement has brought to issues of racism and police brutality in the U.S., which also generated more attention to racism in the public schools. And so these are like victories being won by what you might call the left of the culture wars that the right then brings extra attention to and heat to in their. So almost always, not always, but almost always the left, the right fights culture wars on terrain the left's winning. But this seems to serve the right better when it comes into actual sort of electoral politics.
Yeah, because it becomes a white grievance kind of thing.
Some kind of grievance. Grievance politics can not always, not universally, but sometimes can work well. Especially, I think, if the other party isn't offering enough. And I think this is a lesson for Democrats that goes way back, but when Democrats have their most success, it's because they offer things that everyone can benefit from.
And a positive vision.
And they don't stray from that message, and they tie it to policy.
As a history professor, what are the problems with not teaching the real history of America?
Well, at the very beginning of our talk, you asked about disinformation. I think people are much more easily duped by propaganda or disinformation when they don't have not just historical knowledge, but the sort of skills that historical thinking teaches us. Learning how to read bias or perspective, learning how to understand information in its context, learning, all the things that I think we look for in history helps teach us how to read through political rhetoric. And I just think lots of Americans don't have those skills. And that's why I think history education is so incredibly important, and that's why I do what I do. And I don't know if the right's entirely conscious of, like when DeSantis creates this law, I don't think he's thinking this is how we win politics. We got to keep Americans ignorant. I don't think that's actually what he.
I just think he's trying to win points in the moment, and nothing bigger than that.
But I think the overall or the long-term overarching upshot of it is that keeping Americans ignorant makes them more easily duped by demagogues and propagandists.
Yeah, and in my opinion, Rush Limbaugh on Fox News has basically poisoned our political system to some degree, because you got half the country thinking the other half are demons and yada yada. And that's just not healthy, and say a lot of untrue things. And so then you've got, if you're watching, even though Fox News doesn't have a huge reach, but it's enough to really scramble.
Yeah, and social media has just made it all worse, because the algorithms don't just like keep you in this sort of demonic loop.
Yes.
And there are people and groups who profit from that as well, and make a lot of hay from it. And I think our entire political discourse has been sort of ruined by the sort of Rush Limbaughisation of politics or political media. Because although I would never equate MSNBC to Fox, they still their whole model, their profit model is to make people angry about everything Trump or the Republicans are doing, and I don't think that's good for the health of the electorate either. And so, like for example, my dear mom, whom I love to death, she spends a lot of her time watching MSNBC, and she's constantly sort of angry. And I'm like, well, I'm angry too, but it's good to sort of take a step back and get some perspective here.
Yeah, I agree with you, and it's almost like, you'd be better off, reading about, whether it be in the Post or the New York Times or even the Wall Street Journal, it's not as dramatic, I guess.
Yeah. It allows you to think, and I think reading allows you to think more carefully about whether you agree with the message that's trying to be sold to you.
I agree. In this post-Trump era, what are maybe top 2 or 3 things you think we need to do as a society, as a culture, as political parties moving forward? What would be on your top of your list, 2 or 3 things?
So I think, and I don't want this to sound self-serving because I'm a history professor at a state university, but I truly think we'd be better off in a million different ways if we truly once again committed to funding public education at all levels, including higher education, and that especially if we refocus funding on the humanities or liberal arts. A lot of our problems that we've been talking about, I think, are a direct result of the fact that we just have very few people who are sort of trained in sort of discernment.
Yeah. And discernment is the key to figuring things out.
And so, there's no one person or group to blame for this. This is a decades-long trend, but we just don't fund public education the way we used to. And because higher education in particular has become so expensive, it's understandable that most students, especially first-generation students, want to get a major that they think is going to immediately transfer into a well-paying job, and so they tend to go into business or maybe the sciences if they're capable of doing that. And again, I'm not discounting those forms of education, but it's meant that the humanities have been starved across the nation, and that's true whether you're in Florida, Texas, or Illinois or New York.
That's because too many humanity grads are tired of working at Starbucks, Andrew.
Yeah, right. I know. To me, that's a real problem. And then I think that one of the best ways to bring down the political rhetoric, and again, I'm not saying this will be easy, but would be to have the Democratic Party focus as much as possible on both policies and rhetoric that benefits most Americans. So like support for unions, support for universal health care, support for public education, and just like never stray from that message or that goal, that objective. I think
and the nice thing, those policies do affect all Americans, and they in effect are, if it's a Democratic president, you're a president for everybody.
Yeah, I think I would love to see that. Now that wouldn't be easy because like there are very vested interests opposed to these policies that own media that are going to do their best to sort of poison the water, but I still think that would be it would be worth the effort.
What do you think about with AI coming? It's already here. Universal income, I think, is going to have to happen at some point. I don't know if it'll happen in my lifetime, but I just don't see how it can't happen. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, like I saw a meme, and the memification of politics isn't exactly a great thing, but this one I sort of enjoyed. It was something to the effect of AI was supposed to like do my laundry so I could read, but instead AI is doing my reading so I can do my laundry,
Exactly.
It's not AI in and of itself that to me is the threat. Although there's some like pretty concerning elements of it, especially from my vantage point as a college professor. Because if students quit reading and writing and rely upon AI to do their reading and writing, I mean, that's just going to make all of our issues related to education that much worse. But I think that AI or any form of automation can be beneficial if it releases us from drudgery, and I think it has the capacity to do that. But the question is there really money in that?
Right.
The people who are developing the technologies probably are not thinking in those terms. So again, to me, this is about like where the power lies. Does it lie in private corporations, or does it lie in a more democratically controlled public state or federal government? If it's the latter, I think we can do some good things with AI, but I'm not optimistic that that's the direction we're headed in.
Right. One last question. As a history professor, how do you see the Trump era kind of stacking up, and how important will it be in the future as far as teaching American history?
I think it'll be important. I think that, like, U.S. historians like to create our periods around presidents. So there's the age of Reagan is what it's known as, based on a Sean Wilentz book. There's the Roosevelt years, or the New Deal order. I think Trump's going to get an era named after him, and it's going to be about anger, sort of like a low-boiling civil war. January 6th will be one of the key events that historians will be talking about 100 years from now, if we have historians. Going back to my public education thing. And hopefully, my hope is that it'll just be like a little short period in history that'll be interesting, but that's not going to determine the future.
That's my hope as well.
Yes.
Well, Andrew, thank you very much.
Yeah,
I appreciate
thanks.
you sharing your knowledge and experience with everybody, and thank you. Appreciate
Thanks.
it.
All right, that wraps up our first episode of America After Trump, America's second Reconstruction. I hope you learned a few things like I did from Professor Hartman. He's certainly a wealth of knowledge. Until next week, thank you, take care, and have a great week.